Awesome. Live. First time on Streamlabs in like 2 years. So it's been a long time. So if you start to watch and you can hear me, just please leave a message so I know that the audio is working. It looks like it is, but you never know with these things. So, it's not like there's plenty going on in the world right now, but I talk when my muse tells me to. And I got coming through my social media an advert from a health company, a company that owns a lot of hospitals, claims to be the largest hospital chain, health chain in New York City. A company, maybe company is not the right word, a network called Northwell Health. Never heard of them. I've never done business with them. And I don't recall ever seeing social media posts from them before. That doesn't mean it hasn't happened, but new to me. And the first time I saw one was this morning, and I actually saw an unrelated one. Actually, maybe on a tangentially related topic later today. But the advert had carried the headline or the marker, "Should we circumcise our baby?" Now, of course, I already have a pretty strong view on that topic. I'm not going to have my mind change probably from some random social media, but it's still interesting to see what they're going to say and what they're going to advocate, kind of as a litmus test of like at least where this organization is. And so I went ahead and clicked, and thankfully it's not a super long read. Let me copy this and. Oh, hey, Jim Jesus. I assume you can hear me as I wait for him to reply. Um, so I wanted to see what they were going to say, what kind of tack they were going to take on this. And when you click on it, and if I am able to get into the chats, maybe I can get into the chats over here. Let me see. This might be possible. Do 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 do. Oh my gosh! Wow, I'm live right here. Can I comment? As you can hear me, awesome. Good to see you. It's just for anyone who's curious, I'm going to post this right here. Will it allow me to post a link? Probably not. Nope, it won't. That's fine. Not a big deal. So when you click on the link, you are taken to an article on their website written by a doctor, by Laura Bennett, MD. And right at the top, there's got a picture of a baby and a mom, and it says, "Should we circumcise our baby?" question mark. And then it's not even in it's the subheader, so it's not even the body of the document. The benefits of circumcision are notable, but there are also some potential risks. The pediatrician offers her thoughts. Uh, yeah, I would say that the benefits of circumcision are notable in the sense that they keep changing and are ever evolving, and no account is made by the fact that there's just been a merry-go-round of different things that it's been claimed that it would help with, starting with masturbation, being gay, spermatorrhea, which is a made-up disease, syphilis, chlamydia, cancer, UTIs, phimosis, uh, overactive bladder, cancer, AIDS, but basically everything, every disease that you can have, it's been accused. Probably, I'm still waiting on it to be found to have some benefit for COVID. That'll be the last thing, but that's kind of the pattern. Whatever the craze is, circumcision will be touted by its proponents as a cure or a palliative for that. It's been called a cure that's in search of a disease. So that is very notable because we don't really have other treatments like that. When appendectomies were very popular, and when it was discovered maybe that they were getting overprescribed and that they weren't necessary in many cases, the incidence of appendectomies went down, and people didn't go, "We need to find another reason to justify appendectomies. Maybe we can find something else that they're good for." and add that to the list of that. But circumcision is very different for a host of, I would say, cultural, religious, and psychological reasons. So it'll be interesting to see what they say. He's going to start a whiskey channel. That's not going to be my forte, but we will all miss you. We still have to do a video on the Venus Project and Stefan Molyneux at some point. Just throwing that out there. I've been throwing that out there for a couple of years, but we'll see. Okay, so this is premised with a Dear Doctor letter. This doesn't sound like this is a legitimate letter, but it's possible. But I'll just read this. This is very short, so I can read this whole thing. My partner and I are expecting our first child, a boy. As we inch closer to the due date, the topic of circumcision has been a point of contention. I've heard both pros and cons, but we're struggling to make an informed choice. How do we decide? Sincerely, worried parents to be. My picture is hot. Too much light. Let me see. Also, that's not a compliment. Is that better? A little bit better? How about that? Not too hot? So dear worried, congratulations on your upcoming arrival. Bringing a new life into this world is a journey filled with immense joy, discovery, and yes, some challenging decisions. Right out of the gate, you'll be presented with the choice of whether or not to circumcise your child. It's interesting. Why would that be? There's no reason that circumcision should be done right away. It can be done at any age. It can be done. It's actually safer to do later. The chances of, infants are just inherently much more frail. They're much more susceptible to injury. They can't consent. They can't tell you how much it hurts. Their immune systems are not really set up. There are problems that they may have that you don't have time to establish because they're newborn. So why is this something that has to be done right away? Not something that could wait even just a year or two. Is there any reason for that? And I think that there is a reason for that. That I'll talk in. Well, so I'll just say, like, if there's a religious reason, if you're Jewish, it has to be done on the 8th day. If you're not Jewish and you still want to do it, the main reason that all the medical benefits that people tout happen later in life for the most part. There was a lot of talk that it was good for HIV, but unless you're assuming that your baby's going to be sexually active, it just couldn't plausibly have any effect on that until they were older. And yet, so why the rush? And I think the reason that there's a rush is because if you don't do it when they're unable to consent, then the chances that they consent when they're older is much lower. It's not zero, but it's much, much lower. You don't have to convince a toddler or a neonate that they need to get circumcised. You just do it to them, and there's nothing they can do. They can't stop it. They can't resist in any meaningful way. But once they get older, they can start to resist, and they can say no. And the evidence is overwhelming that if you do not circumcise somebody, even in a culture like the United States, which stigmatizes foreskin to a large extent and really promotes circumcision, the vast majority are not going to choose to get circumcised. It's only going to be a small minority. And that is a problem if you have some kind of identitarian or social desire for circumcision to be more common. Otherwise, this doesn't really make a lot of sense. Okay, so it's been debated for centuries. It's only natural for parents to seek clarity, and this decision warrants some thoughtful deliberation. I would debate that. Circumcision's been around for a couple thousand years. The earliest records that we know of it come from Egypt. Obviously, the Jews and the Hebrews picked it up. Muslims have been doing it a long time. The earliest kind of debates that I think that we have about them are in the Hellenistic age, when the Greeks took over Judea. The Egyptians didn't have a problem with it, and as far as we don't know anything about the Babylonians or the Assyrians having an opinion about it. But when the Greeks conquered Judea and the Middle East, they did have a problem with it. They thought that it was barbaric, and whether they did this because of a heartfelt feeling for the morality of or iniquity of the process, or it was just a way to persecute a minority or to raise taxes, it was banned at various times in the Seleucid Empire. Seleucus was one of Alexander the Great's generals, and he's the one who ended up ruling the Middle East for his dynasty ruled for a couple hundred years. It's called the Seleucid dynasty, and the Seleucids banned circumcision. Later, the Romans banned circumcision, largely in retaliation for a Jewish. There've been a series of Jewish revolts, and so this is one of the ways to punish the Jews. But this wasn't really debates about the pro cons so much. There is some debate in the New Testament whether or not circumcision would be required of converts. If Gentiles were becoming Christians, their first Christians tended to be Jews, but it seems quite clear that within the first decade or two, many of the new converts were Gentiles, especially Greek speakers and later Latin speakers, and they would have been uncircumcised. And so there was debate in the early church on whether circumcision was required for conversion, and essentially that debate came down to no, it's not required, and even that getting it done was going about it the wrong way. Your salvation comes through Christ and accepting him as your Savior through your Christology, not through whether you've got a foreskin or not. And that pretty much was the end of the debate until much, much, much more recently, when in the 19th century, in the same milieu that Zionism arose, some Jews started to debate the practice themselves as to maybe this is superstitious, maybe this is barbaric, maybe we should stop this, maybe we should use this to assimilate. In Europe and in America, actually up to that point, it would have been a point of distinction, a way to distinguish Jews from Gentiles. And if that's what you wanted to go for, then circumcision didn't really pose a problem. But if you wanted to assimilate or blend in some way, then maybe that was a problem. And so you have Theodor Herzl, who's usually considered the founder of Zionism. He did not have his son circumcised. He also bandied about ideas of converting to Catholicism. So you see there's a debate there. And you can even find there's some famous Jewish, so Robert Moses, the guy who ran New York City for most of the 20th century, his mother was like, this is superstitious, I'm not going to have this done. So he was Jewish, but uncircumcised. So there's a debate there. And then there was not really a debate, but it became rapidly popularized in the Anglosphere in England, and then especially and much more so in the United States. And there doesn't seem to have been a lot of debate. The science of surgery was just coming about. We had just discovered how to do how to sterilize, and so surgeries were much safer than they'd been in the past. And so suddenly surgery became the rage. This is before the germ theory of medicine. We didn't know about bacteria or fungus, antibiotics. None of that stuff had been developed yet. We had a little bit of immunization, like the smallpox quote unquote vaccine, and surgery. And so surgery was the answer to everything. And people have a lot of problems. Like venereal disease was a big problem, as it's always been. So what are you going to do? You're going to use surgery. What's the only thing that they can really do? You're going to castrate them, cut off their dick, or maybe just cut off part of their dick. So there wasn't really a big debate at that point. This was just kind of proposed as the new thing, and then it became a popular thing. Debating that it's wrong or that it shouldn't be done is a much newer phenomenon, and then really it's only in the last couple decades. So I think that this is playing fast and loose with the history. So, but anyways, he says there's been a debate. I don't know why I had to give that history. I just felt the need, sorry. But she's going to be thoughtful. So she goes, first of all, let me say that there's no wrong answer, but it does help to be informed. Okay, she's going to inform us. Here's what I always share with my patients when they're in this situation. The procedure is swift and safe. Okay. Relatively speaking, she's correct. It is a relatively safe procedure. There are risks, and she does say this. Yes, circumcision is indeed a surgical procedure that involved in the removal of a portion of skin. A portion of skin. So to just refer to the foreskin as just skin is to trivialize it. That would be like calling your lips just skin, the removal of your lips. The lips are probably the most analogous part of your body to your foreskin. And in terms of their sensitivity and in terms of the fact that it's a transition zone between a dermal zone and a mucosal zone. And so, yeah, we could just say, I'm going to cut off your lips, but it's really just, I'm just removing a little skin. Not wrong, but highly misleading. And if she doesn't know that, she's a doctor, she should know that. So that is a trivial thing. And it's also just a portion of skin, but it's the entire prepuce usually. There are less invasive types of circumcision. I mean, it's one of those things where there's a very standard amount that's almost always done. Hypothetically, less could be done, and there are historical examples of less being done, and sometimes you'll even meet people where less has been done, but it's very, very rare. The American standard is to remove not a portion of, but all of the prepus, all of the skin that covers the glands. That's the goal. So I don't know how you can say that's a portion. That being said, it's relatively easy, generally performed in the first 40 hours for healthy babies. Again, why? Why not wait a little bit longer? Why does this have to be done right away? What's the rush? Oh, because they might say no, or the parents might get second thoughts. It's also, the parents love their baby, but they've also never really met their baby. The longer they know them, the less likely they're going to be okay with this. And the less deferential they're going to be to the medical staff also. During this procedure, the foreskin from the penis is removed. So I'm wondering if this grammar is actually wrong. It does seem it's the foreskin of the penis. So it's part of the penis. It's not attached to the penis. It's not extra skin. That's another thing you often hear, extra skin. It's the foreskin from the penis. So I don't know, you're taking it from. It's an interesting choice of words. Most commonly through the plastibell method, which involves a plastic ring and a tight string. Oh yeah, it's just a plastic ring, She doesn't say that it involves usually a circumcision board where they strap the infant down because it's going to struggle and cry, and you can't have that. You need to strap it down, and then you're going to crush the foreskin in a clamp, and then cut it off with a knife. Now, it's slightly relevant here, unless they're a moil, unless this is a Jewish ceremony, then he's going to use his fingernail and his lips. He's going to kiss it and suck the blood out to cleanse it, and then maybe give the baby herpes. This happens in New York City enough. It's happened plenty of times. It's been in the news. This is a New York-based hospital. Maybe they've heard about that. They're not suggesting you do it that way, but to try and sanitize it as much as possible. It's similar when they want to talk. I mean, when they're talking about female circumcision, they'll say, "Oh, rusty knives, dung huts," just they'll characterize it in the most negative way possible. And sure enough, female circumcision can be performed in a traditional setting without anesthetics, without doctors, without clean implements, with rusty knives or even stone knives. But it also can be performed in a hospital setting that's perfectly sterile. When this has come up in the United States, it's been done by licensed professionals, actual doctors who just happen to be Muslim, who believe that it's valuable, and they'll do it in a hospital with anesthetic, where it's basically as perfectly safe as a surgery can be. I also will say, like, its status as surgery is kind of like debatable. I remember a couple of years ago, I went in to have some medical tests done, and the nurse asked me if I had ever had surgery. And I said, I've been circumcised. And she paused and she just looked at me. She gave me the strangest look. Like, it's hard to describe. It sounds like, "Are you fucking with me?" And I'm like, "That is a surgery, right?" She goes, "No, yeah." She goes, "It is. I just never thought of it." She goes, "No one's ever said that to me." I'm like, "Have you never had a man?" She goes, "No, I have. It's just," so, like, again, that was a nurse, not a doctor, but it's just interesting. Like, it's such a trivial, automatic thing in the mindset of a lot of people, not everyone, but in a lot of people, that it doesn't even register that it's a surgery, that it's just, automatically you cut the umbilical cord and then you circumcise them if it's a boy. Just like that simple. During the procedure, the foreskin from the penis is removed, most commonly through the plastibell method, which involves plastic. I already read that. Other ways to complete the procedure involve clamps and direct cutting, or a thumbnail and a rusty knife and lips of some pedophile like a moil who likes to suck baby dick. I mean, literally, the Hebrew word, the procedure in Hebrew in the ceremony, it's mepitza bepeh. Mepitza bepeh. And that's what you call a blowjob in Israel. If you're in Grindr and you want to get a blowjob, that's exactly the term you use. A doctor may use a local anesthetic to numb the area, so it will not be painful for the baby. May use local anesthetic. So she says may, because they very well may not. In fact, in most cases, they don't, because it's usually not very safe to use anesthetic on neonate. They're too young. It's too much of a risk, and so this is not done. And when this was in its heyday in the United States, the doctors who really promoted this the most, they honestly believe, and they said many times, that the neonates are vegetables. Neonates can't feel pain, that they have no, there's nothing you can do to them that's going to affect them psychologically because they can't feel pain. And we know this isn't true. Obviously, they're not as developed as an adult. They obviously have limitations, but to say they can't feel pain is ridiculous. And it's interesting, she's admitting they may use anesthetic. Well, then they may not use anesthetic. In fact, they probably won't. It would be dangerous to use at least general anesthesia. So it is the thing here, it won't be painful if they use anesthetic. Will it be painful if they do not use anesthetic? And I think the answer is yes. Obviously, in fact, it's very hard to imagine something that could be more painful. This would be torture to do, like just to an adult or whatever. It's actually worse for a baby in a lot of ways. When you're older, the foreskin will be typically, in 99% of cases, will be detached from the glands. But when you're born, the foreskin is fused to the glands by a membrane, very similar to the membrane that separates or binds your fingernail to your finger. And part of the process of circumcising a neonate is you have to peel with forceps, or again, if you're a Moyle, with the fingernail, the foreskin off the glands. And then you can crush it and chop it off. This will damage the glands and also be incredibly painful. It'll be more painful than with an adult where it's already detached. It would still be painful for an adult, but at least it would not involve messing up the glands anymore. But like how she says they may use anesthetic. Why doesn't she say that in many cases we can't and we won't? So there we go. Risks do exist. Oh, here we go. Any surgical procedure comes with its share of risks. With circumcision, potential complications can range from bleeding and infection to the possibility of removing too much skin. What's the standard for deciding how much is too much? And I emphasize to my patients, though, while this procedure carries a small degree of risk, complications are very rare. How rare exactly? We actually don't know, because neonates cannot lodge a complaint. They cannot say, hey, you messed up. Parents, it's going to be bandaged. They're not going to see. If they haven't seen a lot of baby dicks that have been circumcised, they don't really know what it's supposed to look like or not supposed to look like. And so we don't really have a good idea of the incidence of this. I have met plenty of guys who had skin bridges, skin tags, other injuries that I think must have been from circumcision, where their glands have been smeared and mushed and scarred horribly. And what's interesting, skin bridges are the ones I feel the most comfortable with, because we know that's from circumcision. That is, a skin bridge is where a bit of skin will reattach. And so it's called a bridge because it forms like a I'm going to say a flap, but a connective bit of skin, usually from somewhere on the shaft to the head. And every guy that I've met who had that, and I haven't met so many guys that we're talking about like, oh, well, LinkedIn Earth, or you've met thousands of guys, this is a 1 in 10. No, this is like in the percentage, just like, sub 5, but more than 1%. And that's assuming that, there are people I met who had them corrected later. But even as adults, very often they don't know why that happened. They just think that they were born different. And so the AAP, which she referenced here in a bit, has even admitted we don't know what the incidence is. So for her to say that it's rare, we don't know exactly. The list of complications is very long, and a lot of them are not going to be reported, and there's no systematic attempt to do so. So we just don't know. It's whatever we know is the minimal amount. But yeah, here we go. So it's interesting though that that's where she ends the cons. The cons are just the surgery, that there's some risk from the surgery. We don't know how bad the risks are actually, but that's the only con. And not to spoil the document, at no point does she talk, this female doctor, discuss what is the value of foreskin, which maybe she speculates a little bit later, but What is it for? What does it do? What are you missing if you don't have it? None of that is a factor. None of that is to be considered. We're cutting off healthy tissue. It makes sense. If you're going to remove someone's breast, hey, just so you know, this is what you're going to be missing. And there are cases where an adult might say, I want to go. If you have the BRCA1 gene or whatever, and you have a really high likelihood that you're going to develop breast cancer, you might make the rational decision, I want it removed. But you shouldn't pretend that the breasts have no value and are worthless and you don't need them at all, and so you can just remove them willy-nilly. So why do it? Historically, the roots of circumcision lie in religious and cultural custom. That's absolutely true. Medicalized circumcision is a much, much more recent phenomenon. And the early medicalized version of it is very much tied to the religious. The earliest medical desires and ideas with it were tied into things like sexual purity, masturbation, Victorian social norms, and it was only the end of the 19th century that it started to achieve and be seen in more purely medical terms. But let's see. In fact, there's an evolution theory that suggests that foreskins might have served to protect the function served a protective function in times when clothing wasn't always worn. Well, that's just a theory. I've heard this proposed. I think this is people who favor circumcision. They want to say it's worthless, and so but then the question is, well, then why is it there? Why did we evolve it? Everything we evolved was for a reason. It wasn't on accident. It was functional. It was adaptive. So why would and for those reasons, maybe you should not just automatically assume it should be removed. And so a theory has been purported. Well, it's to protect the glands. And now that we have clothes, we don't need that anymore. We've had clothes for a long time. We had clothes for about 70,000 years at least, minimum, probably longer. But that is not it's absolutely true that prepuce will protect the glands of the penis. That's absolutely true. But the foreskin is not just a protective cover. The foreskin has functions of its own. Any guy who's uncircumcised uses his foreskin every time he jerks off, every time he has sex. It's a big part of it. Now, you can still survive without it. You can still reproduce without it. This is Ben Shapiro's big. It's not mutilation because I can still have kids. Well, circumcised women can still have kids. That doesn't mean it's not mutilation. There's a lot of things we can cut off your body and you can still procreate. That doesn't mean that it's not. It doesn't mean that tissue doesn't have a purpose or a function, or that you're not losing something. Yes, you can still survive. There's plenty of things we can cut off. You can still survive. Cut off your ears. Cut off your nose. Cut off your lips. Cut off half your dick shaft, or your entire glands, or one of your testicles, or your breasts, or your nipples. Some of your fingers, some of your toes. These are all things that could be removed. You could live. You could still have kids. Doesn't mean that those things are worthless or that they have no value. All those other things in our modern society, we have things that we can do to help. We can give you prosthetics. We can give you better clothing. We can give you medical treatments if we destroy things. And, all that's possible. That doesn't mean that it's okay, that those things are trivial and they have no value, and that they should, in the scales and the pros and cons, should just be zeroed out as nothing, which is what they're doing here. And this is just a theory that has really no evidence. You have to be ignorant of the functions of foreskin. Anyone who's ever hooked up with a guy with a foreskin can tell you it's not just a protective cover. That's the least of its most basic functions. In my years of practice, I found that while traditions play a role, many parents are influenced more by potential health benefits. For example, there's evidence suggesting that circumcision can reduce infection risks for males, especially urinary tract infections, as well as aesthetics. Okay, so the medical doctor here is telling us that, aesthetics. Okay, and this is totally true. I know a doctor who's Jewish, and he thinks foreskins are gross. He thinks they're disgusting. And when he meets parents and they ask him, he doesn't say, I have a fetish for cut cocks and I think foreskins are disgusting. He says, oh, I think that the benefits outweigh the risk and you should do it. And he doesn't disclose that he has a bias, to put it mildly, And if she's going to cite aesthetics, that kind of says that she has a bias too. It's also interesting that she's giving this advice based on what parents told her. So I'm a doctor, but these parents told me that they're doing it because of reduced risk for infections. Okay, but aren't you the expert? Shouldn't you be giving the reason why? Like, why don't you also say, well, a lot of my patients are Jewish, which we'll get to in a minute, and they say that they want to get it done for that. So you should get it done because my Jewish patients say that they want to have it done. Yeah, so there's been an endless litany of things that circumcision has been supposed to cure, fix, to reduce syphilis, chlamydia, gonorrhea, cancer, phimosis, which it does cure phimosis, that's true, but phimosis is not a serious issue and does not require circumcision to cure. Masturbation, spermatorrhea, which is a imaginary disease in the 19th century. A lot of doctors felt that if you have any form of ejaculation of any type of fluid that's not going into your ovulating wife, that is a disease that causes you to go crazy and have epilepsy, and so circumcision will help you with that. And then more recently, and this is telling that it's not included in here, there's been a strong effort to say that it can reduce HIV infections. The studies that are purported to show that are highly controversial. I'd love to make a video just about, I keep saying that for years. A clear example of motivated reasoning and with no evidence that it's actually true. In North America, there have been large studies of hundreds of thousands showing no correlation between those men who are circumcised and those men who are not in terms of their HIV infection rates. Uganda and Kenya are different. Those studies were not good studies. They put their thumb on the scale in every way possible to get the result that they wanted, and they misrepresented their results basically to make a talking point. And despite all of that, that talking point is not showing up in this document. This document is clearly very biasly pro-circumcision. And the fact that it's not included here, I think, is telling that evidence is really poor. So if this, I would say this is like a low-key propaganda piece. If they're not including that, it's because it's so weak. Urinary tract infections. The evidence on this is very debatable. Girls get far more urinary tract infections than boys, and nobody says that we should circumcise girls, even though there's plenty of doctors in North Africa who will tell you that circumcised girls are less likely to get a host of other diseases, and it logically makes sense. If that tissue is removed, that tissue can never become infected. It can never become a vector for infection. It can never have any other problems because it's gone. It's been removed. You're not going to get a hangnail if your arm's amputated, right? You're never going to get an infected ear piercing if your whole ear is removed. And yes, there are certain problems with the foreskin. Problems can happen with any part of the body. If you remove the foreskin, those problems are not going to happen. But that's also true with female circumcision, which is ethically considered completely unjustifiable to the point of, and there's a little checkmate here, where they'll say male circumcision is not barbaric because it has these health benefits. Oh, well, what about the health benefits of female circumcision? No, that's so unethical that you can't study that. You can't even, we're not even going to look at those studies. It's totally wrong. It can't be studied. The University of Cairo be damned. North African doctors, Muslim doctors who say this, and they do. It's just totally anathema. So we're just going to ignore that. So we have a nice cultural barrier here and an aesthetic barrier as well. So it's interesting though. So she hasn't talked about really any of the cons. So, I mean, the big con is that you lose your foreskin. And we know that guys who have their foreskins when they're adults are very unlikely to want them to be removed. And it would be actually a horrible crime to just remove a foreskin from an adult without their consent. That would be a major sexual crime. It would technically be rape in a lot of ways. That's another thing, is like this procedure, the way that it's performed, meets the definition of rape in many places. But again, we're so culturally attuned to it that it's just like, who cares? It's fine. It's amazing how many conservatives now can get so incensed about transitional surgeries for minors, and with good reason, but then are completely blind to this. There's a difference in degree, but also a difference in scale, where this is something that's affecting half the boys still in the United States, whereas as bad as transition of minors has become, it's not anywhere close to that, even though I would say that that's a larger degree of intervention. The choice is ultimately more personal than medical. Yeah, I mean, look, if we're going to cite aesthetics, While the American Academy of Pediatrics, this is interesting too. While the American Academy of Pediatrics has stated that the benefits of circumcision often outweigh the risks, it's not an imperative for every newborn. It's not an imperative. Like, it's great, but it's not an imperative. So there's two things she's leaving out. So this is published in 2023, this letter here. The American Academy of Pediatrics came out with this recommendation in 2012. In their paper on it, their cultural bias was really obvious. They cited culture and religion as reasons to have it done. And this drew a lot of flack from other medical professionals. Said, this is a medical journal. This is a medical recommendation. You should not be citing culture and religion as reasons to have a procedure done. And yet they did. Several of the doctors in that group were Jewish. One of them said that he circumcised his own son on the dining room table with, quote, 3,000 years of my ancestors looking over my shoulder. Now, he then claimed that it had no effect on his advocacy of the procedure, but come on. He put himself in a position to be in this thing. They also said that the benefits outweigh the risk, but they admitted they didn't know what the risks were. They didn't know what the incidences. The other big thing, though, is this was in 2012, and it had a 5-year window. And if you go to the AAP website, I pulled it up right here. If you open up their PDF, it's got a big... So this is the AAP's website right now. You look at it right now. Look up their circumcision policy statement. And stamped over the cover of it, it says, this policy has expired. This is no longer, so like their policy wasn't that it, and what was her words? That it's not imperative for every new. Yeah, they didn't say it's not imperative. They said the benefits outweigh the risk. That's a little bit different. But this policy is expired. It's been expired since 2018. That is 6 years. They could have had another policy, and it also would have expired after 5 years by now. We don't know why this is exactly, but it does seem like they had such a backlash, and their arguments were so unmedical and ethically absurd that they're having trouble coming up with a new one. Because if a truly honest one would say this is not something that is necessary and it really shouldn't be done, there's no medical justification for doing this. If you're going to remove healthy tissue, the standard isn't do the parents think it's aesthetic or not, or are they Jews or not. We would never accept that for Islam. We would never accept this for girls, for any religion. This has been litigated with Muslim girls, by the way. There have been Muslim sects say, hey, we can circumcise our boys. We should be able to circumcise our girls. And in some cases, the version of circumcision that they do to their girls is less invasive than the circumcision that they do to their boys. Female circumcision does vary more than male circumcision. It has more and less extreme versions. In the most extreme versions, you're talking about infibulation, the removal of all external genitalia. Yes, that is more extreme than male circumcision. There are other forms of female circumcision that involve, quote, a ceremonial pinprick, which removes no tissue, leaves no scars, and draws maybe a single ceremonial drop of blood. And you could say, in principle, that's wrong, and I would, and that shouldn't be allowed. But you also would have to admit that is far more mild than any form of male circumcision. And yet that's a crime. You can't do that in the United States. It's a horrible crime, and no one cares if you're a Muslim. It says this is part of my culture, my religion, or my aesthetic, and I think it looks better. Never would be justified. The choice is ultimately more personal and medical. Yeah, that's totally true. So why is she giving her medical opinion here? While the American Academy, stated blah, blah, blah. So how does she not know that? Does she, like, that to me is what the problem, she's a doctor. I know that. It says right on their page, this is expired. This policy has expired. They don't have one, which means there's no recommendation. And probably the reason they don't have one is because they would have to argue that it's not recommended. Because that's what the overwhelming evidence, the only evidence that says it's not, that it should be recommended, essentially, is cultural and religious. And that's not medical. You're talking about the Hasidic League of rabbis giving medical advice at that point. I believe it's deeply individual decision, but not for your boy, for you. It's not his decision. right? It's your decision. And as parents, you should, I mean, yeah, you have a fiduciary responsibility. There's a lot of decisions you can make, but you can't cut away healthy tissue without a really compelling reason, like a medical necessity. Oh, he's got cancer, he's going to die. Okay, fair enough. The thing is, if somebody like dies and a judge is trying to decide, what to do with their estate, what would they want? What's the most likely thing that they would want? And you could always say, well, hypothetically, they wanted to commit suicide, or maybe they'd want to donate all of their money to a circus. It's possible, but you got to go with your gut. And what we know is that men who are not circumcised as infants, when they're adults, almost never choose to get circumcised. It's very, very rare. Most of them end up really liking that they have foreskin. They really enjoy their foreskins. Now, they aren't always self-conscious about it in the sense that it's just part of their dick and they like their dicks. And they don't necessarily go around saying, I love my foreskin per se, because it is just an integral part of their penis. But they don't want to get circumcised. There's a few who do, but it's less than 5%. Even in the United States, it's probably something like 1% or less. And so you would have to assume, all things being equal, that newborn infant would never choose to have this done. And in the rare cases that he does, he can have it done. That's the great thing. I mean, you can dispute you. There's no reason this has to be done in the first 48 hours or on the 8th day. They're 18, 19, 16, whatever the age of consent you want to throw out there. They can have it done then. No problem. So, yeah. And then there's no ethical question because they're consenting. I always recommend sitting down with a pediatrician to get a comprehensive perspective. As you grapple with this decision, stay well informed, but don't ask her to tell you that the policy statement is expired for 8 years. Keep up lines of communication. Always prioritize your little one's well-being as you strap him down to the cutting board and remove the most sensitive part of his penis for life. Great. So anyway, I was curious about this Northwell thing, and I looked him up. Sure enough, they're the largest health provider in New York. It's a nonprofit. And up until 2015, it was called formerly the North Shore Long Island Jewish Health System. Wow, imagine that. Now, are they disclosing that they are a Jewish organization that have religious and cultural biases when it comes to male foreskin? I think it would be very fair to say that Jews have cultural and religious biases against foreskin. And it was pretty obvious, in this letter, this fake, assuming this is real, whatever, ask for what are the pros, what are the cons. I don't see any pros of foreskin here. I mean, the only pro that offered was like, well, there's a theory that before we had clothes, it protected our foreskin, the head of the penis. The inference being, the implication being, and now that we have clothes, it is vestigial. This is also, I mean, what I was told as a kid. It's like a human tail. It's from like when we were cavemen. It has no function anymore, and that's just patently false. Every man who is uncircumcised uses his foreskin every time he jerks off, every time he has sex. To say nothing of other potential benefits. It's sadly very understudied for all of their acclaim here. Health systems in Europe don't do a lot of R&D and don't do a lot of research. Most of the research in the world, I think it's like 75% of the medical research in the world happens in the United States. And it just so happens the United States has been a majority circumcised culture where the medical industry in particular is very biased against foreskin and for circumcision for the last 100 years, 150 years. And so it's actually a very understudied bit of anatomy. What most medical students are taught is how to remove it and nothing more. This is slowly changing. But the evidence that it has value above as just protective cover, like your dick is the thing and it's just the cap on top, that is patently false. You have somebody who doesn't have a foreskin and doesn't know anything about them averring that, but that is a supposition and a theory in this case that's based on total ignorance and completely implausible. And again, I mean, you could say that about hair, and we would never justify, well, we're going to scalp everybody, because hair is just there to protect your head in the African savannah. Yeah, maybe. Doesn't mean cut it all off. So, yeah, not good. not good at all. So yeah, so I don't know this. I mean, I don't know if this doctor is Jewish, but this organization definitely is, and they're not disclosing that. I mean, just imagine if it had been a Muslim organization that was talking about how you should circumcise your daughters because it's more aesthetic, and many, you sit down and decide what's best, but obviously you want her to look good when she gets married, and she can't have labia for that, because good Muslim men don't like labia or whatever. If that doesn't sound stupid and horrible and disgusting, yeah, it is. But then to say that for, oh, well, everyone wants to have a mushroom dick. It's what everyone approves of. So yeah, so this thing is clearly very, very biased. Also, why is I don't live in New York? Why am I getting these ads? And this isn't even an ad per se. Like, they're not, oh, and here's the link if you want to have it done. This is like a PSA. So this is something that they believe in, that they want to promote, even though there isn't necessarily a fiduciary incentive. Like, they're not going to make money off of this app in all likelihood. Certainly not from me, but probably not from anyone. Like, the point of this is not to drum up business or marketing. And sure enough, the one that came later today, as I said, I got this message, and then I got another one later today, not message, but it came across my feed, was about that masturbation is healthy. And how that's it's funny. In this one, they actually used a banana with the peel removed from the tip. In the masturbation one, the peel is fully on. But they're not making any money off of a masturbation thing, right? You don't go to the doctors to cure your masturbation or whatever, unless it was to get circumcised. 50 years ago you would, but or 100 years ago. So that tells me this is not about them trying to make money, or this is an ideological thing. They want to promote it now, and they're more subtle here. It's like, oh, we're just showing you the pros and cons. Really, there are no cons, and foreskin has no value, and it's beneficial. Now they have to tone down what they can claim, and they have to pad it with things like aesthetics and religion and culture. And I will say, just personally, I do think that the religious thing is quite true for Jews, and also for Muslims for that matter. But it's psychologically very important even for people who aren't members of religions who value circumcision, because psychologically, men who are circumcised are much more likely to favor circumcision. This has been shown in doctors. They've surveyed doctors. Doctors who are circumcised are far more likely to suggest circumcision than doctors who are not. Fathers who are circumcised are far more likely to suggest circumcision than not, although not always, and there are, for whatever reason, this has changed. I've heard of and seen and know. I mean, there's at least 2 or 3 father-son pairs at my gym where the dad is circumcised and the son is not. I would love to know why that's happening, but it does. But doctors in particular, though, have a buy-in, because if you've done them, you have to justify it, because the moment you admit this maybe isn't justified, then they're, if not legally culpable, I would say that they are, but even if you said that they're not legally culpable, they're ethically culpable. Then you did an unjustifiable thing. And potentially you did an unjustifiable thing thousands of times. So they have a very strong psychological incentive to continue to promote the procedure and to pretend that it's fine, because to do otherwise is to invite their own guilt. So I think that's also a larger part of what's going on. And it's a bit of a catch-22, because they're the authorities. And so as long as they say this, the courts are going to defer to them, and the ethicists are going to defer to them too. Say, hey, look, they say it can reduce infection risks for males. Yeah, it can for females too, but no one said that's okay. And again, those studies are quite controversial. For instance, the famous study that came up with this UTI benefit, the doctors instructed the mothers, the parents of the uncircumcised children, that in order to keep their penises clean, that they would need to fully retract their foreskins and clean underneath. That is totally incorrect advice. As I was saying earlier, foreskins are fused to the glands of the penis when you're born in 99% of cases. And then they slowly, over time, detach and become retractable. And the mean age, the age when half of boys can retract their foreskins is about 10. So if you were to get 110-year-olds, about 50 of them would be able to retract, and about 50 of them would not be able to retract. And this continues, and it's not until 17 or 18 when you have to start saying, okay, maybe the retraction process is going to have to be aided by some type of intervention that 9 times out of 10 would still be more mild than circumcision. There's exercises they can do, there's devices they can use, steroid creams, whatnot. But when you're talking about a neonate, a toddler or younger, the vast majority of them are not going to have retractable foreskins. And if you forcibly retract one, not only is that extremely painful, and I know someone who had this done to him when he was 5. I'm talking to him when he's 25, and he still says it's the most painful thing he ever experienced. It totally, I think it psychologically scarred him really deeply, and he thought that as well, to the point where he didn't like his penis being touched, because it evoked that memory of that pain that happened when he was 5. Now, if you do it to a neonate, they may not remember, but it's going to be really painful. But the reason it's going to be painful is you're going to do a lot of damage and cause very, very likely open wounds, which raises the risk of infection. So the doctors are telling the intact children, their parents, to do something that is very likely going to increase the chances of an infection, and then saying, oh my God, they had more infections. Yeah, of course they did, because you had them do something that's likely to cause infection. Now, was that the intention of the study? I don't know. I think that it was just ignorance. There's just a lot of evidence that this idea of when you can retract or not was not well known in the medical industry, and there just was ignorance based on that. But that's where that study is coming from. So, all right. So obviously, no, you should not have your baby boy circumcised. Okay. I'm still down to collab on Lulbert stuff. Just mostly over making it alone. Yeah, we all have to face our. If you're still here, Jim Jesus, I don't know if you still are. We should definitely do like a postmortem on the Venus Project and Stefan Molyneux. I know he's still alive, but it seems like he's been banished from social media, which I don't agree with. I'm sure you don't either. But it brings nostalgia to my heart to remember all of his creepiness. Aren't curved up things only caused by circumcision? No, not only. You can have curvature of the penis for any number of reasons. There are non-circumcision related causes of that, but circumcision is one of the causes. It's quite common when the procedure is done. It is the most common surgery. It's done a lot, and very often it's done by the least experienced, newest doctors. It's often rushed. You're in a situation where you know the patient it can't really complain. It's hard to think of them in the same way as an adult, rightly or wrongly. And there have been cases of just doctors just going and botching all of them, like just doing a batch of, 6 or 7 kids all at once and just horribly mutilating them. The John Money case that Matt Walsh has made so popular, that came about from a botched circumcision. The circumcision was so bad that they just decided to remove the entire penis and testicles. Now, it's interesting that he'll mention that and like, well, why are we? A whole other story, but like, yeah, I don't know what the ratio is. I don't think anybody does. What percentages of the curves are from circumcisions and what percentage are not? I don't know. But it's not the only thing. There are other things that can cause that. I'm a big fan of the expression, his body, his choice. As am I. I think that parents have a wide latitude in decision making when they have a child. But it's not your property. You have a fiduciary responsibility. You've created a life. That life has rights. And you can't just kill your child. You can't just do whatever you want. And you're responsible for it. You owe it. It didn't decide to become your child. Even if you didn't decide to become parents, you risked having children, except in the very rare circumstances where you were like if a female was raped. or a man was raped. That is possible, although very unlikely. Um, like, so even in case you're like, well, I just wanted to hook up, I didn't want to have kids. Well, you took the risk of having kids, and so you like, just like when I get in my car and drive around town, I'm not trying to hit anyone. I don't want to hit anyone. That's not what I'm. I'm going to go to Dairy Queen or whatever, as you can see. But that's not a defense. If I hit you with my car and you have to go to the hospital, I do owe you restitution. At least ethically, I know the legal system, it may not see it exactly in that way, but like, I owe you restitution. And my intention, the fact that my intention was not to hurt you, but to go do something else, and that was just an accident, doesn't absolve me of anything. Maybe it lessens my guilt in some sense, but it doesn't absolve me. And the same thing, if you weren't trying to have a kid, but you still did, now I think it's possible to transfer that. If you say, I really don't want them, you have to take care of them until somebody else will. You can find someone else, I'll take on the responsibility. But then it gets, what can you do? What can you not do? And I think it has to be like, you're holding the kid in trust. And you can't do things that are irreversible, right? So you can make him go to yeshiva, you can feed him a kosher diet, you can dress him up a certain way, you can teach him Hebrew, you can make him read Torah or Talmud or whatever, take him to Israel, kill a bunch of Palestinians, whatever. But you can't cut off part of his dick. And then if he decides when he's older that he is real serious about the Jew thing, he can have it cut off. And I know someone who did that. Yeah, he got circumcised when he was 29, but he was always Jewish. He got more self-conscious about his Jewishness when he was older, and he's like, I'm going to show what a good Jew I am, and he got circumcised. I have another friend, basically the same age. They're both from the UK, who's an uncircumcised Jewish guy. He also became very self-conscious about his Judaism. Like, I'm going to go to Israel, I'm going to join the IDF, which he ultimately didn't do, but he talked about it for a couple of years. And I was going to get circumcised. He's like, never, ever. So, that's who should be making the choice. Also, it's not a cost to the parent. Like, you're not imposing on the parents. You're actually saving them money because they're not paying for the circumcision. There's also to point out too, and this, I should have said this in the other earlier part in the video. The incidence of urinary tract. This study was terrible, but even by this study's own metrics, you would have to circumcise something like 300 or 400 boys to have one not get an infection, and yet the incidence of botches is higher than that. So you're going to stop one UTI maybe, according to this flawed study, but if you cause 3 or 4 skin bridges, it totally cancels out. And the fact that when they do it, they just always ignore. They just say that the risks are trivial and that it's super safe. And it is relatively safe compared to other surgeries. Yes, compared to open heart surgery or whatever. But there are botched circumcisions. They're underreported, but we know that they happen. Their incidences are not rare. They're in the percentage, I would say it might be more than 5%, but it's definitely more than 1. And so, like, it completely cancels out any benefit if you're talking about net. And of course, you shouldn't even be talking about net. That's not the way you do medicine. Do you think that misandry is a driving factor behind the prevalence of circumcision? Oh, remind me. I used to know what that word means, misandry. Oh, the hatred or contempt or prejudice against men. Uh, I think that is a motivation for some people, but not most. I think that there are certain feminists who look at it like, I'm getting back at men, or I'm also showing I have power over men. But I do not think this is the main reason. I don't think this is the main motivation for most people who are advocates. Most of the advocates are men. And I don't think most men have misandry. There does seem to be, and this I've talked about this before with the transing. There does seem to be a small number of men who have autogonophilia, who are aroused at the idea of not only sexually transitioning themselves, but sexually transitioning others. And there are men who have fantasies about circumcising other guys and specifically babies. That it's, I mean, we would be psychoanalyzing them, which is just fraught. But when they demonstrate that they do have that motivation, then you know it's fair to kind of guess. I mean, it doesn't matter what the reason is. Is it the reason because they were circumcised and that's how they're coping with it, or because they had an early sexual experience with somebody who got them into? Who knows? But there is evidence that the most rabid pro circumcision people are like this. So the world over, hands down, the most pro circumcision guy in the world is a guy named Brian Morris. He's a doctor from Australia who is infamous. He says if you don't circumcise your baby, it's child abuse. Whenever you see, and it's funny it wasn't mentioned here, very often you'll see studies show he has made a cottage industry of just publishing metadata analyses that are always biased, where he will ignore all things positive about foreskin, count everything positive for circumcision, no matter how ridiculous or discredited, and then say studies show it's 2,000 times better or whatever. And he publishes them over and over, and he has a whole method to his madness. If there is a study that shows that foreskin has a value or a function or anything, he will write a letter to the publication that created it saying, objecting to it. They may not publish the letter, but then when he does his meta-analysis, he will then totally ignore that study and say, well, it was objected to, and then he'll cite his own letter, you know, for example. And this guy, and he is the font of almost all of this now. He just popularizes it so much. He was a member of something called the Galal Society, which was a society of doctors. It was a group of doctors, an association of doctors, pro-circumcision doctors, who would share videotapes of babies getting circumcised amongst themselves. So he's quite creepy. If you ever see interviews with him, he's got a 1,000-yard stare. His eyes he just looks like a psychopath. Are most doctors like this? Is this doctor like this? I probably not. But the thing is that tiny minority, just like most doctors don't have autogynephilia, but the ones who do are incentivized to go into that position and then flex. And the thing is, that doesn't work if you're going against the mainstream in some big way. So like, I don't know, you could be a MAGA doctor who tries to go and then make it so that, I don't know, whatever MAGA thing, and the left is just going to say no, it's going to ignore it. But if you can appeal to their biases the way that the WPATH was able to with the trans issue, then you can bend like the whole system to your will. It's quite a hack. And circumcision is interesting. It doesn't fit into the left-right worldview so much, but it has this enormous, well, you've got all the Jews who are for it, which, to be fair, a lot of the anti-circumcision activists are Jewish, and there are a lot of Jewish people who are not circumcising their kids now, and that it might even be true, possibly, that they might have a lower rate than Gentiles in the United States. Our data on that is low, but it's actually possible. So that, please don't, I'm not saying it's all Jews all the time, but among many, it is a fundamental part of their identity, and they're super, super jazzed about it. But even among Gentiles, it's become part of their identity too. If you're a guy and you're circumcised, it's part of who you are, just forever. A doctor who's saying it's justified and it's great all the time, that's not going to be scrutinized in the way that it should. Speaking of Anglosphere, Richard Dawkins is disappointingly apathetic on the issue of circumcision. He's biased because he's circumcised. I didn't know he was circumcised, but I'm not surprised. He is old enough. People don't know this typically, but circumcision was quite common in the UK up until 1948. Now, it was not as common as it is here. The best estimate is that it got somewhere up to around a third of the newborn babies were getting circumcised in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. And then in the late 40s, the NHS basically decided it wasn't justified, and the rates fell tremendously. But he's older than that. He was around before then, so that tracks. That makes sense. And of course, unless this cut guy becomes an intactivist, they typically don't care about it. And the other problem is uncircumcised guys typically don't care about it too, because it's not their problem. Uh, my first memory is my circumcision. That can't be true. Welcome back. How have you been? What do you do for work now? Any good books? I work from home mostly now. I got a good job working from home. I don't want to go into too many details about it. Yeah, there's always good books. I should do book reviews again. Um, but the one I'm reading now is Maximus. It's a book about mega sporting events, especially FIFA and the Olympics. I have several memories as an infant. Do you know how old you were when you got circumcised? Were you 8 days old, 48 hours old, or did it happen when you were like 4 or 5? I've heard stories of people who it happened when they were 4 or 5 and they don't remember it, or sometimes they do. Around birth. I, I'm gonna say I'm skeptical of that, but I guess it's not impossible. I mean, like, what do you remember about it? And Stephen, aren't you from Canada? Aren't you from some part of Canada? Canada is an interesting case. People debate, are national health services, national healthcare, universal healthcare, are they pro or anti circumcision? And a lot of people think that, well, because in the UK, the NHS, they didn't ban circumcision, but they just said we're not going to do it unless it's necessary, and it's just not necessary most of the time. But a national health service could just as easily say we're going to do it. We want to do it. It's mandated. In the United States, circumcision is subsidized in many states. Medicaid covers it, even though it's not medically necessary. It's actually illegal because Medicaid is only not for aesthetics. You can't get a boob job with that. You can't have plastic surgery or Botox. It's for medically necessary procedures, and circumcision is not medically necessary. It's even coded that way when you bill it in the insurance. It's not necessary in 99 cases out of 100 or whatever. And yet they just de facto cover it. And it's been removed in many states, which is part of the reason the rates have gone down, especially on the West Coast, but in other places as well. And in New Hampshire, it was defeated by one vote to remove it from Medicaid. Um, and so it's kind of neutral. Canada, my understanding is that the policies were set at the provincial level, and that most of them by now, I don't know if it's true, all of them have now basically said it's not justified and have stopped doing it. So like I was talking to a nurse from, I think it was Saskatchewan or maybe Manitoba. It was one of the prairie, not Alberta. It was either Manitoba or Saskatchewan. And they were saying, as a nurse, he'd seen a lot, and he's also gay. He'd seen a lot, and he said you could date the year. This was in 2019, and he was saying like the 26-year-olds and younger all were uncircumcised, and the 27-year-olds and older were all circumcised. So the policy had been changed. Oh man, I'm going to do the math terrible. In 1992. So like in 1991, maybe I have these years off a little bit, but you get the idea. In 1991, Saskatchewan was saying it's necessary, and they were automatically doing it to basically all the boys. And then in 1992, they changed and said, no, we're not. And they stopped doing it unless they actually asked or whatever. And the rates declined. And there's other examples. New Zealand is a very famous example where New Zealand went from basically zero circumcisions almost to almost 100% for about a 20-year period, or 25-year period. And then in 19, I think 72 or 71, back to almost zero. because their National Health Service just went from, and it's a high conformity society as well. Do it, don't do it. And I've never been in New Zealand, but having talked to people who are from there, they say absolutely. You can tell if if an older guy is 72 before, he's going to be cut. If he's 72 after, he's going to be uncircumcised. Woman did it. She had red lipstick. Okay, well, I imagine that's how it would feel. Felt amazing. So I have memories. I have memories that I can date to when I was one. Things that I remember that I know about people I met who died, when I was very, very young, and certain other events. Um, the problem is, and this is actually kind of not just with your early childhood memories, but like I don't have an internal chronometer, and so as most people don't, so sometimes I have to think about what year was that and kind of go with the details. Where was I? What was I doing? And kind of work it out in my head. And I don't really have those markers for early childhood. I moved when I was 5, so I can associate memories in one place have to be before I was 5, and memories after obviously. I have quite a few memories from 5 and younger, but I don't think I would remember. I don't remember being circumcised. So I'm hearing you. I'm not saying you're wrong. I will say there's some skepticism there. It's very easy to have false memories. To say that, as someone who's implanted false memories into people, I'm sure you haven't been hypnotized, but like that's also possible. But you don't have to have someone do that. You can auto generate that, but just reliving it, thinking about it. Again, I'm not saying this is what happened with you. Just the reason for my skepticism. Like, I don't know what the science is on this either, by the way, if this has been really, really studied super well, or if they understand it. Infants, I mean, Ron, I forget his name. He's one of the intactivist Jews. I think it's called The Deepest Cut or The First Trauma or something. But the first chapter, it's really good because he just talks, what do we know about what a neonate can sense? What do we know about how they perceive the world? And it's been tested. So like there is some things you can determine if they can see color or not, and they can't see color. You can determine what they can recognize audibly. So they recognize their mother's voice first. They don't recognize their father's voice until a little bit later, until I think a few days or a few weeks. So, it's also true that just because you don't remember something doesn't mean that it doesn't have an effect. It's more likely to be a hallucination. Yeah, I think I don't know if hallucination is the right word, but again, I don't know. It's you were there, you lived through it. Your body experienced it, your mind experienced it, whatever state it was in. So like the idea that you couldn't possibly retain any of that, I think it's I wouldn't take it for granted, but like I also, and how do we check it? Unless you could start reciting details, but those are things that you probably could find out later anyway. So, all right. Any other questions? Should I do more videos? Less videos. I've been very busy, but I do have time to make them from time to time. Oh, what, Stephen, you didn't answer. What year were you born? And what province? You're from Canada. Am I right that you're from Canada? The system has totally collapsed. 94, Ontario. Okay. I think Ontario is one of the more Americanized ones, like Alberta. It's my understanding the Maritimes and Quebec obviously historically have not been very circumcisey. British Columbia also, and then Alberta is basically the U.S. culturally, and Ontario is highly, highly. I mean, it's Ontario. It's basically part of the U.S. Be curious if that's circumcision policy Canada. Elective circumcision procedures are not covered under Ontario Health Insurance Plan. When did that change, I wonder? When that I'm not finding. Oh, this is old. 1995. Starting to drop. My brother got it done the last year it was covered, and they did me to make it not quote weird. Yeah, it would be weird if siblings didn't match, but that being weird is not that big of a deal. They're not going to look the same anyway, and they're probably not going to be comparing. It's the same thing with the dads. Um, like, yeah, I think that's a psychological cope more than an actual reason for most people. I've I do wonder why that happens. I knew a guy here years ago who was the third of four boys. So it was two boys above him, and then he had a younger brother, and he was the third. And he was uncircumcised, and the other three were all cut. And he had no idea why. I was like, did they just forget? Were you sick? He said, I don't know. They never explained it. None of his brothers knew. He wasn't super curious. So it's like there's obviously a story there, but he didn't know what it was. But also, it didn't bother him at all. He wasn't like, oh, I'm weird that I have more sensitive dick. Like, he was fine. They never made fun of him. So, you know, that sucks. So you think that they probably ended the policy in 93 or 94 in Ontario. That sounds about right. Yeah. So, yeah, universal health care is not an argument for or against circumcision. It can go either way. Definitely, it should not be subsidized. Um, and there is a movement to get it unsubsidized in the United States that has been partially successful already. There does be a feeling that it is declining. It seems that is true, but not super fast and not without a fight. You know, because I look at an article like this. This a decision was made at this institution essentially to promote circumcision to the public. You know, not to merely recommend it to their patients, but to promote it to the public. And one has to wonder why that would be. You know, do they just because the purported medical benefits that they list are trivial. You know, like I get with the COVID vaccines, for instance, which I'm not vaccinated, but like you could understand from their perspective, hey, this is going to protect you from death, maybe. It's going to keep you from getting really sick. If they think it's going to help you not spread the disease and maybe kill somebody else, then it makes a lot of sense to really promote it. And they really, really, really promoted the vaccine super hard. Um, the purported benefits here, and forget my qualifications and why this is based on an old and a very dubious study, but let's just accept it at its face value that there's a slightly lower risk of urinary tract infections, which are not serious and are easily treated without circumcision. We have them with girls, and no one ever talks about attempting to reduce the incidence of UTIs with girls by circumcising them. But let's just leave it as that. This is such a trivial benefit. Why would they care? Why would they have any interest in promoting that to the general public, which is what they're doing with this post or whatever? This is not drumming up business for them. They're not targeting. I'm not in New York. I'm not anywhere close to New York. So like, it doesn't make sense from a business point of view. It doesn't make sense from a public health point of view. Aren't there like a million other things that are more relevant in terms of public health? You know, eating healthy, going to the gym, not getting too much sun, not eating the wrong kinds of plastics, not, I mean, it doesn't matter. Getting your vaccines, your other vaccines, all the other one, like every other vaccine that you can think about. Wouldn't that rate higher than this? Why is this something that, so that kind of speaks to there's something emotional and cultural about this. You know, a lot of the intactivists will say they want to make money, and it's true. They do get paid for circumcisions. But I don't really think that's the real reason. There's no health care. Try going to the ER. You won't get health care unless you're on the verge of death. Yeah, this is very predictable. I wondered why this had died down. I mean, I remember this was a hot topic in the early 2000s. Alas, the system in the United States is quite terrible. It could be so much better than it is. You know, but I mean, I had minor surgery. It wasn't anything major, but I had a couple lipomas removed. They weren't dangerous or anything. But like, I call up a dermatologist, and I was in there like a week later, and I just paid cash. And I went in, and I left an hour later, and boom, paid, done. Like, no problem. Like, and way more expensive than it should be, but also pretty affordable. I know there's other. It's far more expensive than it should be, but it's not that. It could. The reason it's expensive is not because we don't have enough government, because it's already running more than half of it. Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know if maybe I'm just in the wrong circles, but we always used to be beat over our head. We got to be like Canada. We got to be like Canada. We got to be like Canada. I guess if it's that bad, but where's the surprise in that? Of course, it's got worse. It's the government, you know, and everything, and the way they set up their programs is almost always in some kind of pyramid scheme, where they have some kind of temporary surplus that they squander, and then the system can't sustain it, or they increase benefits or whatever, or it's not tied to productivity, and so you end up squeezing those that are productive, like Alberta, to pay for everybody. Alberta and Ontario to pay for everybody else. Maybe Saskatchewan a little bit. The Saskatoon. I think that's over now, though. So, all right, guys. Any other questions? Circumcision or anything else? Parents that did circumcise, especially Ontario and the GTA. I am curious about this AAP thing. If the real reason they have not, it's now 12 years since they have updated this policy. Expired. This policy has expired. I'd heard that. I didn't know if you went on their website. Boom. It's right there. I also had heard, let me look at this, that one of the main doctors, so I talked about Brian Morris, internationally probably the biggest advocate of circumcision. There was a Jewish doctor at the AAP, though, not the one I referenced earlier, named Edgar Schoen. And Edgar Schoen is the one kind of infamously said infants are vegetables. They don't remember anything. They don't feel anything. He was in the Galal Society, and he seemed like somebody who. It seems what happened is circumcision was very popular. It got almost universally, done up until they think that about half the newborns were getting circumcised by 1920. That ratio went up until the 85 or 90% by the 50s and the 60s. And then in the 70s is when it started to go down in Canada. It started to go down in Australia and New Zealand. There started to be a lot more, like in the broader Anglosphere, it really fell out of favor. And there's even videos you can find of Dr. Spock, who is the famous, people debate how good of a doctor he really was, but he was very influential among parents, and he had advocated it for many years, and he'd come out and he just said, look, the evidence is that it's not justified at some point, I think in the very early 80s. And so there started to be this questioning in the literature and in the broader culture that maybe this isn't justified. It seemed like something that had just been there forever, but that's really not true. You can go back. I mean, again, I have a grandma who's 104. So like when she was born, half the babies were not getting circumcised. So it seems like time immemorial, but that's really not true. And then what you have is you have a certain number of doctors who they're doing it because they think it's common. You have a certain number who are apathetic. They don't really care. But then if you have doctors who feel very, very strongly that it's justified, and it has to be emphasized, even their most outspoken proponents, have to admit these are like trivial benefits. Even again, if you ignore the cost, the big scam is that they just ignore the costs completely. They completely devalue foreskin as essentially worthless. But even accepting that completely biased tipping of the scales, it just really isn't that important. It's not that valuable. There's no reason to be agitated for this in the same way that you should be for the COVID vaccines or the polio vaccine, or the smallpox vaccine, or things that are genuinely really, really beneficial. These are trivial and marginal, and so it doesn't make a lot of sense medically to get really jazzed about this stuff. And the fact that they are indicates that there's a motivation there that's probably not strictly related to public health. That it's potentially religious, certainly possible with the Jewish members, of which there are many, but also just personal. I don't think Brian Morris is Jewish, but it's part of his identity, and also maybe something that he's sexually aroused by. So some of those doctors, I think Edgar Schoen comes to mind, a few of the others, I think probably made it a point to go where they needed to go to form a redoubt, to resist this move away from ubiquitous male circumcision. And this is the product of this 2012 AAP. If I remember the history right, if we went back to the previous one, the 5 years before this, so the 2007 one, they had kind of said it just wasn't justified. And then they were worried, oh no, people are going to stop doing it. And so the Edgar Schoens of the world got together and said, let's go and make a new one. And they twisted into all the backflips and cited culture and religion and aesthetics, for Christ's sake, and came up with this. And there was a massive backlash against it in the medical profession. Not that it was a big deal in the news or social media, which really existed by then, but like, there's got to be a reason they have not come out with another one. Like, now 12 years into the future at this point. So, and there has to be a reason why the author of this paper somehow does not know that it's expired, and is telling, she's giving her expert advice by omitting the fact that she's basing this on an expired, that the AAP itself describes this policy as expired. So, all right. Well, nice seeing all you guys tonight. Now that there are more people watching than previously, but it's getting late. So